A few years ago, I laughed my ass off at Jim Rosignol's review of Street Cleaning Simulator, and that moment might have been a developmental stepping stone on my way to making this very YouTube channel. But I'll never know that for certain. How different would my life be if I didn't laugh my ass off at that review? I don't know. I'll never know. The implications of that are terrifying. I am terrified by the ambiguity of the butterfly effect. And somehow, that makes me wonder what causes and effects led up to the state of the 1.0 build that Jim Rosignol's game is in. I'd like to be able to say that his writing has meant a lot to me, but what does his big game project mean to me? Actually, it also means a lot. I had high hopes for it, which I know is always unwise, but this game ends up sadly representing at least one failure for lofty games writing skills to translate into lofty game development skills. I don't know, at least I can still look up to Greg Casavin. Sir, You Are Being Hunted is at 1.0. It's not early access anymore. It is considered worthy for retail release, as if it wasn't before because you could buy it and play it last year. Anyways, Sir is a survival game about collecting treasure while being pursued by murderous robots. It procedurally generates an archipelago of 5 islands with 17 necessary collectibles scattered between them, and you must return all of them to a stone circle in the middle of the islands to escape. That means that you have a lot of walking to do, and there aren't many interesting things to see or do while you walk. This game's geography has a way of spacing objectives out from each other and spawning in the most predictable and unexciting scenery to a level that creeps way past the point of boredom. It also has a way of spawning in the least liberating but most constricting loot items, and a way of handling AI in combat that makes its most dramatic moments also its most frustrating moments. This game's version of first-person stealth is handled Far Cry 1 style. Guards have unscripted movement when they're set to stay put at certain nodes, but they march in mildly predictable single-file lines when patrolling across the islands. And no matter how you play, you're going to face trouble with this system, because those 17 necessary collectibles are going to be guarded behind AI that has unpredictable movements. Sir, You Are Being Hunted is billed as, and wants to be played as, a stealth game, but it gives you very little stealth tools to work with, and it forces you into confronting guards who work in packs and have unpredictable movement patterns. You can't dash in between their patrol routes to grab the thingy and go. You have to deal with them somehow, most reliably by distracting them with one of 5 throwable noisemakers. Even then, I couldn't really figure out a consistent cooldown timer for their distraction period, which means they can potentially turn around and spot you at any minute, in which case you're shit out of luck in the early game. Sir doesn't start you off with any kind of attack. You have to dig around, potentially for a very long time, to find your first melee weapon as an uncommon loot drop. But until then, you might notice that you don't always need it. Since most of the enemies use shotgun weapons with a spread that isn't wide enough to handle the long distances that combat occurs from, you can just soldier through the pellets and grab your objectives fairly safely. That's because your health regenerates fast enough for you to take hits. Your regen rate is determined by your vitality, which is determined by how long ago you last ate. And since the game's dice-rolling loot generator loves to drop food and bandages but hates dropping weapons and ammo, it's awfully hard to let that vitality drop below 70. There's no challenge to keeping your health regen rate high, and that minimizes the threat that the enemies pose. Assuming that you stay out of close range, and you can since you're fast and jumpy enough to outrun enemies, you'll find yourself having an easier time just sprinting through gauntlets of bullets rather than consciously sneaking around to set up traps and distractions. The idea is that as you collect more of these objectives, more difficult enemies will spawn in to patrol the islands. But really, the stakes just get lower the more you play. The initial sense of danger gives way to an eventual sense of frustration, a sense of cynical attrition when you discover that quick loads reset enemy positions, or a sense of abject existential dread when you realize just how repetitive and lengthy the process of collecting and returning 17 doodads is going to be, a sense of soulless economic rationalization when you start to strip inventory space to plan out fewer trips to mitigate your risk and minimize your travel time. Gradually, the game becomes less about stealth and more about guerrilla warfare, about pestering rather than overcoming an invincible and unlimited army of foes who aren't really all that threatening but can't be defeated because you literally don't have enough bullets for them all. Eventually, seeing a ridiculously long line of alerted enemies trailing behind you starts to look normal, And that's about the same time that the stealth system just dies. In between holding Shift and W, you might go looting through abandoned villages for useful supplies, of which there are very little. Well, the drop rate for the potentially fun items is very, very low. The game liberally distributes food items, which makes the cooking system irrelevant, but there's no crafting to do anything with all the junk items that it also liberally distributes. The combined drudgery of poorly built combat, stealth, and survival gameplay inside of open-ended levels way too big to support them is what makes the boredom happen. This game gives you a huge stretch of outdoor area to explore, and it tasks you with exploring it via the 17 necessary doodads, but there's not an awful lot going on out there. There aren't many gameplay features to indulge in, and many of them that are there are rendered irrelevant through poor balancing. And I can't help but feel like a lot of it has to do with poor usage of procedural generation. Critically acclaimed survival games like Minecraft and Terraria that also procedurally generate their worlds manage to distribute a healthy dose of beauty and a mystique of secrecy to the worlds that their systems churn out. The procedure behind their procedural generation forces a certain density of pretty geography, secret areas, powerful loot drops, enemy mobs, safe zones, and diverse biomes that are placed with a sense of pacing to them that vaguely does resemble traditional level design. But the formula behind the worlds that Sur generates is much more obviously transparent, because it has less variables to work with. Sur You Are Being Hunted uses procedural generation to spray paint blobs of brown, featureless terrain on top of muddy water. Villages, clutter objects, and architecture just get scattered in the most bizarre of places. There are houses with front doors that get half buried into a hillside. There are roads that lead to nowhere and walls that aren't connected to anything. The low fidelity of the assets combines with unappealing geography to create islands that look almost alike, each one as boring as the last. After sneaking, evading, and collecting your way to the 17 doodads that trigger a quick ending sequence, you're left with about as much explanation as what you started with. Why are you trapped on this island with murderous robots that can only be escaped via Stonehenge? I don't know. Story hints come through a telepathic narrator who doesn't really manage an effective balance between intriguing mystery and synthetic game tutorial. Occasionally, you'll find a note that doesn't really explain anything. It just stings to know that this game finally crawled out of early access only to give us a hole where an enjoyable game should be. It's a vast, empty, doldrum space that lacks the enjoyable and creative possibilities of its premise. It even lacks character and charm. Jokes and humor are processed through yet another soulless automaton of procedural generation, with poncy Britishness gags being mad-libbed out of a joke generator that's working with enough mundane and unfunny terms to produce completely straight-faced results that don't read like jokes at all. It's about as haphazard a system as the terrain generation, which will somehow land you in a lake after sailing a boat out to sea. Something hit me during the end credits, spoiler alert, during the kitschy nerdcore rap you get for winning. Rather than being an exploration of an interesting story or of interesting gameplay systems, Sur is an exploration of a style. A vague idea of a style at that. It's a game preoccupied with the image of silhouetted tweed-wearing steampunk robots marching against a sludge-colored oil-painted sky. But it fails to flesh out that image into a well-developed virtual world with well-developed gameplay to contextualize the characters of that image. There's a choked spark of imagination flickering behind the scenes somewhere in there, but it didn't bubble up to the surface. The game gives us little else to work with, and it ultimately tramples the player underneath the same passionless, cold, robotic tyranny of its own tweed-wearing villains.